Yeah, so youth leadership is important because I think one of the main reasons we haven't made as much progress or as fast a progression that we would like is because we aren't always talking to young people about what their needs are and also how they think we should do things because of this power dynamic that I mentioned, where older folks, equipped obviously with experience and a lot of connections, they feel like they have nothing to learn from young people. And that can be very invalidating, but also detrimental when you're thinking about like creating new ideas and new solutions for things. So the reason I brought up that first barrier, that, you know, if you didn't have U.S. citizenship, you couldn't even petition and sign up to support a candidate in the elections. It wouldn't make me as frustrated as it does if I didn't learn that other cities in the U.S. do it. So like San Francisco, for example, implemented it. So even if you don't have status, you can participate in local school board elections. And so I feel like even those little nuances, right, or just like possibilities, do give me hope that other communities have figured it out. And yeah, just like kind of reiterate this idea that we're not operating or like building community in a silo, right? There's other people who face the same struggles, who've proposed different solutions. Implementing them may be hard and maybe very challenging for like the existing institutions, but like it can be done and it should be done if it's in the best interest of everybody. Because apathy is a thing, like, and I think that part of the reason people don't even care to learn about local elections or might not have the information is not because they don't care at all about education or like certain issues. It's because they have never been reached out to, or they have never been able to participate. So why would they, you know?
Welcome to Through Immigrant Eyes, a podcast created by the Center for Immigrant Progress in hopes of amplifying and uplifting immigrant voices. As a grassroots organization, we believe that to empower our community, we must first listen to what they have to say. I'm your host, Karina Alvarez, and today we are joined by Adriana Gonzalez. Today we're going to talk about leadership and civic engagement, specifically among young people. So thank you, Adriana.
Thank you
for being here.
Of course.
So I guess just like starting off, why don't you just introduce yourself, you know, who you are, what you do?
Well, I'm Adriana. I was actually born in Libertyville at Condell Hospital, but I have been raised in Waukegan all my life. And I identify as first generation college student. I'm a first generation college student, which in and of itself was really hard. And I went out to school in California. When I was graduating, I always had the sense that I needed to come back to Waukegan, reconnect with family, but also just my sense of belonging in the community. And when I came back, I think I went through a lot of transitions, but one transition that has been really significant was that I try to be more involved politically. So I currently serve as the youngest school board member for Waukegan Public Schools. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
Awesome. So I think this is like a good segue to talk about like this topic of like civic engagement. But before like we dive into that, like why don't you talk about like a school board and like what does a school board do and like what's their role like in a school district?
Yes. So we were kind of discussing it before, but one of the things that I always find interesting but very understanding is that when I introduce myself as a school board member, or people see me at like school events, community events, they usually think that I work for the schools, and that's a very different relationship from being a board member. As a school board member, you have to be elected. So I went through a whole campaign process. I learned how to, with the help of Brandon Ewing, who is currently our sitting board president. He showed me all the documents that I needed to submit my candidacy. We, did interviews, tried to get out into the community. We passed out pamphlets that I designed. And once you're kind of on the ballot and people vote, the top 2 or 3, depending on the year of voting, you get elected. And as a board member, you typically are supposed to go to at least 2 meetings a month. That's how our board meetings are set up. They're pretty much every Tuesday because of our committee meetings as well. And in those meetings, you get to vote yes or no on some of the biggest initiatives that the district is undertaking. And they're mostly concerned with, outcomes that we want to see for students, training or development we want to see for staff. And a lot of them are big ticket items in terms of our budget, because our budget kind of highlights what we want to back in terms of funding, and those are our priorities that hopefully will get implemented to directly impact students. So literally everything from, making sure our bills get paid from the books that we order, to ensuring that our operations teams are maintaining our buildings and letting us know to buy furniture or do asbestos abatement. Those are all items that we vote on, as well as, hiring. We get a list of people that the superintendent and her team recommends. We dismiss people. We discipline students. And all of this is done, through consensus, right? So it's not just me dictating one agenda item or agenda decision. We make it through consensus, and I'm one of 7 people that are elected that just ensure that the school is doing what it's supposed to do, but it's also got a plan for what we want to continue to do in the future and how we're going to raise revenue to do that. And all of that time that we dedicate, whether through our meetings formally or informally, like in the community or helping with subcommittees, all of that is 100% free. Like, I don't get paid to be a part of the school board. And that's something that a lot of people don't really know. So it is a huge commitment. But when our meetings happen in the evenings and all of that, we're really all volunteers just dedicating time to focus on what's happening in the school district.
Wow. So
yeah,
it's a lot.
It's a lot.
The school district does.
Yeah.
But it's a very important one, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So can you tell us about what influenced you to serve in this role or to run for a school board position?
Mm-hmm. So anyone who knows me knows that I didn't want to run. It was actually a very last minute decision when I decided to start my petition, because you go through a petition process to, 1, get on the ballot, and then 2, obviously raise awareness that you're becoming a candidate. But I was almost dissuaded from doing it because I knew that I wanted to affect change in some way in Waukegan, but I didn't know if politics was the way I wanted to do it. But I kind of leaned into what everyone else was kind of suggesting and recommending for me, and all of the encouragement that I received. And I think foundationally, I was always interested in education. Even in high school, one of the things that was like a main driver for me was just this idea that, if I was going to be the first in my family to go to college, I wanted it to be at a very high quality school where I wouldn't necessarily take on a financial burden for my family, and they wouldn't have to worry about me paying for it. And I always thought of school as like this I know it's not necessarily a haven because there are different barriers, and there are, fears that we have in relation to what happens in the schools, unfortunately, here in the U.S. But for me, it was a place where I could just focus on what it is I wanted to absorb and also the values that I wanted to have as a person. Because that's the only place that you can really like dive deeply into that, when you have different priorities, right? So I knew that if I was going to contribute to my community, I wanted it to be around young people. I wanted to share what I learned. Not that I know everything, but I did want to find a way to kind of get back into the schools in some way. And I had done it in different ways, like through volunteering. I worked out as a freaking like ACT, SAT tutor at one point. I was very familiar with walking in a college, so I know a lot of folks there. And so I found myself like creeping in to the school in different ways, but it was only when I decided to become a candidate, and with Brandon's help, Brandon Ewing, the board president, that I really now had more of a hold on like, okay, this is the thing. Like I can know what's going on in the schools, even though I don't have kids in the school district, and I'm like a graduate that isn't in any other way tied to the schools. Like I want to be involved, and this is a way I could do it.
Awesome. Yeah. So you mentioned a little bit about like how you had to do all these things, right, to run.
Mm-hmm.
And were there any like challenges, or what were the challenges, that you encountered like along the way of like trying to run or getting on the ballot or anything like that?
Yes. So running a campaign is a lot of work. It's not some aspects of it can be fun, but it's not something that a lot of people, throw themselves into easily. And it wasn't until I was like kind of in the midst of it that I realized all the like different moving parts that went into it. But I think the very first barrier that I felt that was really unfair, or just something that I wish didn't exist or factor into elections as local as school board elections, was that there are certain rules for who can even write their name in support of like your petition when you become a candidate to be on the ballot. And so an unfortunate situation in some of the cases where I was asking people who, were supportive of me, who wanted to support me for their signature, was that, some of them were not citizens, including my own family. And so some of those conversations were about like how unfair it is that, one, we shouldn't, like, that shouldn't matter. If you have kids in the district, like, you should be allowed to vote for the people who manage the schools and make decisions, especially important priority decisions for the schools. But two, that if you want to get involved, that there should be a way for you to do that, right, through your candidates, especially if it's at a hyper local level like this with the school districts. So that was definitely one barrier that I faced. And those conversations, I feel like, were also just really affirming of why I wanted to do it, why I care about my family. Also, like, even though a lot of our family is now graduated from the schools, to just be cognizant of what goes on in the community, whether it affects them directly or not. And just to like use it as a talking point to say, like, this is something that could change if there was enough mobilization around it. So that was like one of the first barriers that I experienced. And I think the second one that kind of ebbs and flows depending on the situation was more around I guess this intimidation that happens when, as we were talking about earlier, this intimidation that happens when you're like a young person trying to get involved in a space that is predominantly composed of people who are, seniors. They have a lot of experience. a lot more connections because of their seniority. And so you kind of battle internally like this self-doubt that you may have about entering the space, but also like you confront that when it comes to certain conversations or certain items that we talk about. And so like during the campaign process, even there was some people who asked me, well, what kind of support network do you even have, like to have difficult conversations around what happens in the schools, or why do you think that you're the most qualified to do this? And I had to kind of just find it within myself to be like, I'm not going to have all the answers, but I do feel like I can relate more closely because of my age and my experiences to what the students are going through right now, and that I have something else to bring to the table. And I remember having conversations with Brandon literally like in the evenings saying like, I'm not going to win. This is just an experiment. We better be prepared for whatever happens. Like I'm still going to be involved no matter what. And just kind of telling myself that even though there was a lot of self-doubt, that it was okay to keep going. And that's ultimately how I kept myself going, because, when in talking to friends and talking to family and talking to acquaintances that I was making along the way, it was never about me winning. I don't think I ever said that as like something that I wanted to achieve. It was about me just like giving myself the opportunity to try doing this and to show people that it's possible, that like you can at least put your head in the ring, and regardless of the outcome, you're at least participating in some of the conversations and representing like your own perspectives.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. I'm really like surprised about the fact that, certain people can't petition you, which is, I don't know, it does make me personally feel some kind of way, because it's shutting out voices, right? Yeah. It's shutting out voices of people in our community, because there are a lot of people in our community that are undocumented. And speaking from, that perspective, it's hard to like figure out how you can be involved or like civically engaged in your community because of your status. And that's just like another barrier. Yeah. And then the thing about like the age, like, we were talking about that earlier, how regardless of like wherever you go, whatever like sector you go into, there's always going to be like that factor when you're a young person of being in a way like overlooked or like not taken seriously. And then that leads to like what you were talking about, like the self-doubt, imposter syndrome.
Yes.
And it's hard, it's hard. But I'm glad that you were able to like get through that, because now you are a board member. So throughout your time, I don't know how long it's been since you were a board member, but could you talk about like some of the things that you've learned along the way, and some maybe positive things, maybe some not so positive things or challenges?
Well, before I answer that, or kind of tied to the question, I did want to mention something about the petition forms. So the reason I brought up that that first barrier, that if you didn't have U.S. citizenship, you couldn't even petition and sign up to support a candidate in the elections. It wouldn't make me as frustrated as it does if I didn't learn that other cities in the U.S. do it. So like San Francisco, for example, implemented it. So even if you don't have status, you can participate in local school board elections. And so I feel like even those little nuances, right, or just like possibilities, do give me hope that other communities have figured it out. And just like kind of reiterate this idea that we're not operating or like building community in a silo, right? There's other people who face the same struggles, who've proposed different solutions. Implementing them may be hard and maybe very challenging for like the existing institutions, but like it can be done and it should be done if it's in the best interest of everybody. Because apathy is a thing, like, and I think that part of the reason people don't even care to learn about local elections or might not have the information is not because they don't care at all about education or like certain issues. It's because they have never been reached out to, or they have never been able to participate. So why would they, you know? So kind of segueing into the question, for me, I've learned a lot about myself as a person being a school board member. I think that there have been a lot of traumatizing things that I've gone through, prior to college and, these years post college and during my term, that to me were never, it didn't ever dilute my hope that things would get better. I feel like I'm a tough person because I've gone through some tough things and I've witnessed some things that have formulated the way that I view the people around me and my worldview. But being on the school board has challenged me in a way that even those things don't compare to, which has been like really difficult to grapple with because, a lot of people share it, but I don't think it's often talked about how when you're like trying to contribute to your community building is really hard. And educating people is really difficult too, especially when you don't always have the tools or when people have opposing ideas of how that should be done. So I've learned to not react always out of this defensiveness or this fear when people are bringing up concerns. Because there was a lot of days on the school board after meetings where I would just be sobbing, like I would just be crying, because of the intensity of the subjects that we were talking about and the incidents that we were dealing with, which should be no surprise to anyone if you're, reading the headlines and keeping up with the news. And I think for me, it made me check myself as well, and to figure out, what I wanted out of this experience and what more good I could do to figure out like not only how I could be effective, but also like what my impact is supposed to be and who it's supposed to be for. And I think that that's always a good thing when you're facing challenges, whether it's like your service or a job or whatever. When you're presented with those difficult situations, I think I've learned not to feed the flames, but to figure out how I could be solution oriented and where I could be the most useful. And so I think the first 2 years of my boardship, the term is for 4 years. I'm in my third year. I have, I think I don't even have like 6 months left now, because the election is going to be in April. So I'm not too far away from the end of my term. But I think my first 2 years look so different from where I am as a board member now, because I understood that lesson of, not letting what is happening or the symptoms of these crises that we're witnessing derail me from the larger project at work that a lot of us are trying to contribute to, inside the schools and outside the schools. And yeah, I think for me, it's always been more of a bridge to the things that I know have contributed to structural inequality. And I think it's even radicalized me a little bit more, because I feel like government works really slowly to address some of like the social problems that we face as a community. But And so I feel like I've figured out a way to put my mental health first in all of that. And also realize that, you know, change is gradual and there's a process for it. And it's about empowering people who can, you know, create a group of things going on, instead of just counting on like one specific thing to do it all. So yeah, I'd say like I've learned a ton and it has not been pretty.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah.
I bet. So, as we were talking about, like, being young and, in different spaces, why do you think that youth leadership is important, particularly in schools like Waukegan High School that serve predominantly Black and brown students?
Yeah, so youth leadership is important because I think one of the main reasons we haven't made as much progress or as fast a progression that we would like is because we aren't always talking to young people about what their needs are and also how they think we should do things, because of this power dynamic that I mentioned, where older folks, equipped obviously with experience and a lot of connections, they feel like they have nothing to learn from young people. And that can be very invalidating, but also detrimental when you're thinking about like creating new ideas and new solutions for things. And so I feel like it's important to also let young people practice what it means to be a leader, because you're never going to have that resume of experience if you don't get the practice and you don't get opportunity to vocalize your views. And so, even at the high school level, we have as part of our board, we have a student board member position. Now we have two because of our previous student board member who was very adamant about, wanting another person in that position with him. His name is Victor Hinojosa. He is a great student, great leader. I think he scares some people when they meet him because he's very passionate about a lot of different issues. And it's really nice to be able to say that a young person is bringing their perspective, their whole perspective, right? Not just as a Black or brown individual, as an individual who lives in Waukegan, which is a predominantly low-income community, blue-collar community, but as an individual who has the whole life ahead of them, to imagine what kind of world we live in. And so I just feel like young people are so much more creative. And I really do think that when you're younger, you have not only more of a imagination for possibility, which we should be nurturing as adults, but you also do things with less fear and less distrust, which, I'm not saying that everyone should be naive, but I think youth really promote the kind of values that we should be embracing as a society, of really collaborating with one another and seeing each other in the best light versus, maybe in the worst light, where we could assume things and have these biases. And that's not to say that all young people have that perspective. There are certainly others that do not, but it's because of how they're socialized too, right? So I just feel like it's important to have that diversity of perspective for sure.
Yeah, it's definitely important. Something that I've been noticing in like doing all this research for like voter information is that there are a lot of like older people in these positions of power, which there's nothing wrong with that, right?
Yeah,
like
inherently nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, but I definitely see like a lack of young people in these positions of power. And I feel like we have just so much to bring to the table because of the different lens that we have. And I think it's so powerful to be able to like have a say or like have your voice heard in a room of very important people. Um, and sometimes, kind of like going into like our next question is how can young people like build up leaderships? Let me look at
Yeah. As you're looking at it, one thing I also wanted to mention was that I hear pretty consistently, or at least I heard it growing up a lot, and it was a phrase that I was always a little bit uncomfortable with, but definitely more uncomfortable with it now, where a lot of people, older people, would say, like, young people are the future, young people are future leaders, and all of that. And one of the reasons it didn't sit or resonate with me a lot is because, you know, young people are present now. They're sometimes exhibiting leadership behavior and qualifications now. And to say that there's like some kind of timeline that they have to follow for that to come to fruition has always been like something really crazy to me. And I feel like that is sort of a phrase that encapsulates how we treat young people, and maybe why they don't feel as welcomed in certain spaces, because there's this overwhelming feeling that like their time isn't now, it's going to come later. And I think I definitely felt that in my campaign and in my boardship even now, because I think growing up, I was always like the straight A student, the like, I got to do everything, the extracurriculars. I got to, make everyone around me proud and be the person that they can rely on the most. And then I got to be in this position where like, oh, you're the leader, you're so great, Adriana, you're going to go far. And I land where exactly I want to enact change. And then people are like, oh, no, you can't be doing that. And so that's always a funny perspective too, that I reflect on, that, growing up, I was the kid, right? All my teachers said I was like quiet, but I was like the pleasure to be in class, quiet, but the pleasure to be in class, super smart, all of these things. And now I'm in a position of a little bit of influence, where I'm vocalizing some of my views and what informs those views, and it kind of catches people off guard. And I feel very strongly that we need to give young people that confidence to be that voice in the room, and to not feel like there's some enigma that these are people we built relationships with, and that we have something important to say that is legitimate.
And kind of what advice would you give to like a young person who is like trying to, build that courage to explore like leadership positions, or like how can they, get involved in leadership or even in civic engagement at Waukegan High School?
Yeah, so I think the first step to even thinking about it is having a conversation with yourself about your why. Like, and people always mention that in different contexts, about having like a why for, your actions or your involvement. But I do think it comes into play more strongly because in these kinds of situations, it's going to be common to confront people who have different ideas and perspectives than you. And so you have to confront that self-doubt head on about what it is that you want to accomplish, and like why this is the path you want to take. And I feel like that self-reflection can also help you gain the confidence, right? And reaffirm your skills, and to say, yes, I'm young. Yes, I have a lot to learn, but like, this is what I have learned, and this is what I do have in my toolbox right now. And building from that, thinking about ways to get involved. I I think people's perception of getting involved is so sometimes skewed. um, I feel like there is this perception that in order to contribute to your community, you have to do this like big ticket item, or you have to be the most popular person and known to be the most helpful person. And that can be a part of it. I think that that could be a huge part of it, or something good to aspire to. But you could also build confidence and that repertoire doing simple things. Like for me growing up, it was always about like, how can I be a better friend to the people around me, right? How can I have a better relationship with my family, some of whom I have struggled to create better relationships with, right? And what is it that I do want to contribute and I have capacity to do that can make all of our lives better? And I feel like in that, it could be a very small thing, right? You could be a part of a local club. You could be a part of a club at the schools. You could support a teacher. You could, find different ways to just build those relationships with people that can, kind of build that confidence and that skill set that you need. But if you want to be involved politically, you just have to know who's out there. And I think sometimes that's the toughest part, is just the getting started. But for me, I was like, well, if you have an issue at the school, you got to know who the principal is. You got to know who your child's teachers are, right? You got to know your counselor, your social worker, those like rudimentary tools, just like the awareness of them is important. And I think once people write them down and they say, okay, I know who this person is and what they do, then they can kind of understand the network that they want to participate in. And so for me, it's always like, first that self-reflection, but then that exploration of like, okay, once I know what I want to do, who's out there doing it? Who can I support? Who's easy for me to access that could give me an in? And yeah, I think it all kind of grows from there. I'd say that that's how I started too. And I feel like that's also one of the things that brought me back home, because I think there's a lot of people that want to change education or make education better, and they think that they have to go to DC or they have to go to Springfield to do something, right? But a lot of it starts at home. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I could go anywhere else, and I could have gone anywhere else, right, to try to do the things that I'm doing now, but I wouldn't know the schools. I wouldn't know the names of the principals. I wouldn't even know some of the teachers, right? So it's a whole different thing when you're actually like knowledgeable about what's familiar around you, and you actually see how important it is.
Yeah. And like something that like we also at CIP have been thinking about is like, how do we, well, one as an organization, but also like as individuals who, we might not be the most experienced because we are also still young, mm-hmm. but how can we like help support, mm-hmm. young leaders in the making, mm-hmm. I don't know if you have some insight on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it has to just understand, or has to do with understanding that young people have a lot of different obligations right now. And also like their preferences are different than even when I was in school. So I think one of the first barriers, or like one of the first things to tackle in trying to help young people, is just understanding where they hang out, what's important to them, what are they motivated by. And I feel like that answer is always going to vary, but in the situations where I have been able to talk to students and like hear their perspective, I sometimes don't even, I mean, I'd say a lot of times I don't even answer the conversation like introducing myself as a board member or introducing myself as someone like that's trying to persuade them of a certain thing, if they're, if they're thinking a certain way, but just really hearing them in their own words first, and then figuring out where I can make some connections. And I always, because of this power dynamic, right, of us being older and young people being where they are, I also like try to give them more grace, because I mean, they're developing their worldview, right? And they're coming to us with questions, knowing that we have a little bit more experience, but you have to give them an opportunity to reach out to you and reach out when there is that interest, right? So I think that's been like the main strategy for me, where if I can make myself available, I do. I show support where I can. I go to the events. I think that's one thing that like we don't really do, that I think I would be interested in promoting a little bit more, is the idea of like having alumni or younger folks closer to the students' age go to the events that they like put on at the schools, to show them that people in the community who probably relate to them a little bit more are actually supportive of what they're doing. Because typically at the orchestra and band concerts and the games and all this stuff, if you're not a friend, a fellow student, if you're not a family member, big brother, big sister, little brother, cousin, and if you're not a guardian or a parent, you're really not in those places. And so if you want to empower youth and start building a relationship, I think it starts with doing those little things too, so that they see that they're doing a really cool thing that they should keep doing. And whether they build that relationship with me or somebody else, that they know that there's people who really want them to shine. I think that's how we do it.
Yeah. So important to listen to young people. Me and our other CIP team member, Francis, we were talking about how the needs are different now for students. And we were talking like specifically about undocumented students, because a couple of years ago, like college students who were undocumented, some of them had DACA, right? And there's a lot of stuff going on with that, but a lot of the students now never had that opportunity, and so their experiences are different, right? And so their needs are different, and where do we fit in, right? And trying to support them. And one of the things we talked about is, well, we need to listen, right? We need to figure out what how they are viewing things, how they are experiencing things. Because I don't know what the saying is, but like the people closest to the problem are the ones who know the solutions, right? And so it's so important to listen to our youth.
One other thing I wanted to mention, and maybe it'll tie into a future question, but one issue that I feel like affects students today in a more exasperated way, or in a more high profiled way than maybe we had understood before, is just like the mental health component. And I feel like part of the relatability situation, or like the building trust, requires young people to know that adults are also going through certain struggles with their mental health, and what informs that. Because I feel like, some youth get very despondent, and they want to disassociate, and it's because of all the things that they're facing, and they don't realize that, or they may not have a trusted adult, right, that they confide in to say, I'm going through this, and this is what sucks, and I feel like this is, the XYZ reason about myself, right? Because a lot of times, they'll be harder on themselves than they intend to, or than they think that they should. um, and and I think that that's a part of it too, of like not only listening to their needs and their priorities and what motivates them, but also knowing that they're a lot of times in this vulnerable place, but that they're not alone in that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. So the next question I wanted to ask was, as a Latina leader on the school board, how do you ensure that these needs and the voices of your students, particularly Black and Brown students, are heard and they're addressed? I think that sometimes students can be dismissed, right, by teachers or other staff, and how do you either like advocate or help them advocate for themselves, and how do you do that?
Well, that has like so many prongs. One thing that I try to do very consistently as a board member is just to, because I keep in mind all of our students, right? I know that we have Black students who are being pushed out of our school. We have Brown students recently arrived that don't speak English and are English language learners. And they're not just Spanish speakers. They're also like a bunch of other languages that our students speak that we can't even service. I try to keep in mind the rhetoric that we use around our student achievement and our communities, because, I don't know if people know, but some of the language that is used like during meetings or either by community members or fellow board members, even though the intent isn't harmful, and the content of what they're saying might not be malicious, the words can still hurt, or they can still replicate just harmful rhetoric about immigrant communities or diverse communities. And so I think that's one thing that I try to be consistent about, is like, how are we speaking about these things and who are we speaking about when it comes to our students? Because, yes, they may be struggling to read, but there's systemic racism attached to that, right? And yes, they may not be doing the best on these standardized tests, but there's racism behind the standardized tests, right? So I think that's what I try to keep at the forefront, and to continue like being up to date when it comes to like data or research that's being done across the board in relation to that, and potential solutions that we could have. But I think in another sense too, it's also just like, again, tapping into where people want us to be. So one of the things in this past year that has been, even though it's had some contention, I do still feel really proud about it, is that the school implemented an initiative specifically focusing on African American male students and their academic achievement. That's something that I hope is more widely known, but that's the first time that Waukegan Public Schools ever highlighted that demographic and said, we need those students to succeed. How can we move their success, and what levers do we need to pull in order to ensure that it's not just a student by their sheer will and by what resources they may have at their disposal that they succeed, but it's a concerted effort, right? And it's not perfect. I know that there's a lot of community members that wish it were a louder initiative, that it had more of a visual strategy, right? But we're in those meetings talking about what is it that's going to get people in the room to talk about this and convince people. Because, I mean, the reality is that there's some people that don't agree or may have some hesitation around, why are we highlighting this group and not any other group, right? But they're our most vulnerable demographic of students. And kind of coupled with that in a different sense, when we're talking about our Latino students, Waukegan is a predominantly Hispanic and Latino community. those students have different needs. Not all of the Latino students that we have in the district are Spanish speakers, or English language learners, but a huge population of them are. And so what does that mean, right? And I feel like consistently reiterating to our community and to the people who attend our meetings and board members with, different ideas for what we can do in terms of achieving those academic outcomes. It's just like reiterating that, like, we do this together, right? Like, we can help these populations of students together. They have different needs. That's why we are putting funding behind different tools, and that they both and all of our students deserve to succeed. I think that that's a huge part of it as well. Realizing where our money goes and why we're spending that money, and just having the same message and having it be like more of a strategic message when people have doubts about our priorities, right? But to say that, we're not going to recognize the populations of our students, that would be a disservice as well. Because there's families in the district that have a lot of needs, some of who may not know the resources available in the community or in the district. And so it's all about, again, what's the message? What's the core of people's concerns? How can we help one another? I feel like that's something that I've tried to be as consistent as I can about.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Another thing that I wanted to touch on, I mean, you've mentioned, the difficulties that, come with the position, as with, I think, any other position.
Mm-hmm.
All right. How have you managed your mental health, or, what do you do to help support your mental health when things get, a little rocky for you?
I do a couple things, but I think the one thing that has been very helpful is just getting more serious about therapy. Years ago, I had tried to do different forms of therapy, and I feel like I did get some benefit out of it, but I did feel disconnected from the persons or the people that I was seeing. And it wasn't until I think June that I really wanted to dive headfirst into it and give myself more of a commitment to going to sessions and talking about things that really all kind of like bubble up at random points. Mm-hmm. And I was like, there's got to be more to this. I'm bottling up a lot of things. Mm-hmm. And these like crying spells probably are signaling. I feel like my body was signaling something to me that I just didn't want to mentally confront and emotionally confront. And I feel that as much as I tried to like shake it off or attribute it to just like things in passing, it's only when I started to get really honest about how disillusioned I felt and how just really, really sad I felt. Mm-hmm. And honestly, sometimes even angry I felt at why this process is so hard for our community. That's when I made more progress in terms of just being able to handle my mental health better and put it at the forefront. Because at first I would like get the twitches, the eye twitches. I would struggle to keep a consistent eating schedule. I wouldn't be able to sleep. And we've had incidents that really just put me over the edge in terms of like what I thought was possible. And so therapy has helped me kind of regain this, I think, a little bit of confidence in who I am and what I want to stand for, but also like the boundary making that I need to do in order to sustain myself. And that's, I think, to anyone who wants to be a contributing member of their community, whether it's like just socially or politically, that's got to be first and foremost, you know, because Audre Lorde has a quote that goes something like, you know, self self-preservation is a form of resistance. And I don't think that that was as true for me as it has been like in the past couple years. Because I feel like I also do a disservice to others if I give up when I haven't, you know, I feel like I have so many privileges. Like I just can't easily do that when other people are going through so much more. And yeah, so I think therapy was a huge help. Recentering like my vision and what I believe in was a huge help. And then also just like making time for joy, doing fun things. Like that's what you're supposed to do. I think that's what makes life worth living. So I think all of those things combined kind of help me get out of that rut.
Yeah. I think joy and rest is so important, right? In order for us to keep doing this kind of work where, you know, we're obviously working towards creating a better future and making sure that our communities are safe and that they're doing well. And it takes a toll on you, and it's important to rest and to find moments of joy amongst all the grief in the world.
Yeah. And it also can help you like not be upset at people when the system and specific issues are the problem. I think that's a big thing too, to not take things personally. And that's something that I've learned definitely, that I can't hate everyone around me that doesn't get it, because I know why they don't get it. They just either lack an awareness or have been socialized to think a certain way. And it's in those moments that I can, again, recenter myself and also just laugh and be like, oh, this is a crappy situation, but we got to get through this because, you know, ¿pa dónde vamos if not up?
Yeah. How does representation on school boards and in other leadership positions affect student outcomes, particularly for students of color? What have you seen?
Ooh, this may be a controversial take, but I do believe that representation is very important, and that access and pipelines and things like that, people just being knowledgeable of how they can get into the conversation, so important. At the same time though, and I know that it's not just me who thinks, it's a lot of other people, a lot of other organizers. I think representation can also be like dangerously deceiving, especially when we're trying to relate it to our like outcomes, social outcomes, community outcomes. So, you know, on the school board, I am one of 2 Latinas that serve on the board. I think historically we've never had as many Latinos as, you know, proportionate to the community, which I don't think is an inherently bad thing. Just the same way I don't think that like older people representing us is an inherently bad thing. But I think, again, the danger of that is that you may not know all the issues that pertain to a certain community, or may not know how to access the community. And so that's why the diversity is important. But on the flip side, right, to say that if all of the board members were Latino, and wouldn't necessarily mean that our students are doing any better. And that's why I think that even though it's important to educate and to have people know, again, how to be a part of the conversation, how to become a candidate, how to campaign, all these things, you really got to know the levers that can move student achievement. And those can come from all over, you know. People all over the country, all over the world are doing different pilots, implementing different methods in their classroom. You know, there's different ways that people can inform student achievement, and really just giving a voice to the experts and letting them guide that conversation, while poking holes and trying to be constructive. That's important. So I feel like for us, it's been a mix of just kind of implicating ourselves in this false rhetoric of like, yeah, just because we're the representation doesn't mean that things are automatically going to get better. But these are the policies and the things that could make things better, and this is who and how we should be running, right? I think that's a huge thing too. And in the classroom, I mean, I think personally in some of my research in the past, I've always admired and been a strong proponent of people just understanding their histories a little better. And I feel like now we have classes that do that at the high school, which is pretty cool, but it's not like it's a core curriculum. Like we have an African American studies or history class. We have a Latino history class, but it's an elective, right? And, even in our core curriculum, we could be doing more to make our curriculum diverse, and I think we've made strides in that. Our academic team had worked on that a lot, and now reading, phonics and the science of reading is a huge initiative that the state is undertaking, and some of our board members, especially Anita Hanna, had been a strong proponent of that as well early on. But all of those things coupled together really help us get to where we need to in terms of the outcomes, beyond just the representation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So how do you think that schools can create more opportunities for students, for youth to be engaged in leadership?
I think one way is just to create positions for it. I know that some of our schools have like there's always been like a student council.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But there's always like a disconnect between student council being this like kind of spirit, like school spirit driving a club at schools, and it being like, okay, no, we have an agenda that we want the administration to implement. And so I think now there's some of that that structure building, so that students have a say in what we do. And recently, a couple years ago, at least, I don't know if it started the first year of my term, but it has been like an annual thing since I've been on the board, is the Mikvah Challenge. And it's basically like this expo where all of the students create a project for one of their classes, and they choose an issue, a school-related issue, that they want to see changed, and why it's an issue, who's directly impacted. They do surveys to gain other students' input, and then they make recommendations, and their I guess their homework, or one of the objectives that they need to complete, is also getting in touch with a person that could actually implement it. So that's been really cool to see. I didn't go to this last year's one, but in the other years that I've attended, students have talked about everything. Like, they've talked about the food quality. I think that was a huge thing. Now, I think it was a year and a half ago that we changed food vendors. Still not crazy about who we chose. I actually voted the preferred vendor down, but the food changed because we were hearing that a lot. A lot of students have concern about safety. A lot of students have concern about mental health. And so, just having educators provide that space, right, for students to give their opinion, and even not just give their opinion, but allow them to like dissect it even further and like research, get in touch with people, see what other students are thinking, whether it's just them that thinks that way or, other people in a sample that can back that sentiment up. I think those are some of the ways that we can empower students to get involved, for sure.
That is so cool. I wish like my school had that.
Yeah.
I think like, and I'm thinking of like my experience. I feel like if you're not like one of those students, one of those kids who's like very like extroverted, who likes to talk to people, it can feel like I don't know like who I can talk to in the school about this, like or how to address like an issue someone might be having, or just something that they like may not agree with, something that they think should change within the school. And like when you're an introvert, I feel like that can be very difficult.
Yes. Yeah.
And
I can totally relate to that, because even growing up, kind of like how I mentioned earlier, I'm not even joking, in elementary, I barely said a word in some of my classes, and I'm still not quite sure why, but I was just a very quiet kid, and always like in my head, even at family parties, like I would just sit by myself and like try to relax. And I think, again, because of the norm, right, that you're kind of speaking to, I felt like in some ways that I wasn't a leader, or that I didn't have leadership qualities because of that, because I had this idea, and like what was reiterated to me by adults in my life, it was always like this message of like, you should be more outspoken, or you should feel comfortable talking out loud and all of this stuff. And I think that there definitely should be getting out of your comfort zone, like that component should be a part of it, right? As you're growing up or whatever, whether you're introverted or not, just like pushing yourself a little bit should definitely be something to strive for. But I think it's also like very important to validate that, like, just because you're introverted doesn't mean that you don't have anything to say, and that there should be other mediums through which you can say that. And it's oddly enough that it's at this time in my life where after taking a break from social media and like being very intentional about why I did that like I realized I need to shut up and read more, like and then maybe I will like make more strides toward the things that I want to achieve, because I think it has to be like an ebb and flow of periods, of periods where you're vocal, where you put yourself out there, you get out of your comfort zone, and periods where you really honor like the introspection. So yeah, I think quiet kids are the ones that change the world, and that doesn't mean that the loud kids don't. But that's why we have like the different kinds of communication. Yeah.
so kind of like going off of that, what role do you believe that families or community members play in engaging youth, particularly for leadership, youth leadership?
Oh man, they play probably a bigger role than they think, and I'd say that like families play the biggest role in shaping youth leaders. I say that because schools can be a very transformational place, but home is where you go every single day, where you lay your head, and your family values, right, can inform like the path that you take. It's not the only determinant by any means, but it has a really strong influence in a way that, teachers and strangers just don't. And so I feel like I feel very strongly that families should understand better their children, right? And to know that like child rearing, it's intensive, it's not pretty, especially when you get to like your tween and your teen years. I have little cousins who are currently in this phase. But again, because we're the adults, right? I I think it's important to give kids grace, and to give young people grace, especially when they're saying things that they don't mean or that they don't know the implications of. When they're doing stuff that they, maybe if they had more foresight, they wouldn't do. And to use those as learning moments rather than it being like this, like violent, like you gotta do what I say, and like, da 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 da. And obviously I'm speaking from the privilege of not having kids, right? I'm not a mom. I don't think I'll be one anytime soon, but I do speak from a perspective of growing up in a household where my parents really didn't know what to do with me or any of my siblings. And I was the high achiever, and I went home and no one could help me with my homework. And my siblings went, they would come home and they'd want all the answers, and they would just give them, the answers. And so I also think it's not like something that we should morally label families with, whether they're being like a good parent guardian or they're being a bad parent guardian. I know that a lot of families are doing the best that they can. But just knowing that with a little more like love, with a little more tenderness, with a little more like humility too, that maybe as an adult you don't have all the answers, that you can secure an outcome for your kid that, can surpass all of these expectations that you may have about them, or some of the limitations that adults had about themselves. And I can speak very, very honestly about that, because even for my dad, he had an expectation of who I was going to be before I even had a say about who I was going to be. And I crushed his dreams very, very quickly. But, but it was understanding that, right? And not every kid gets to understand that. And so I think it takes everyone in a household to know that the words that they're saying matter, that they have consequences for the child. All the negative comments that they might reiterate could dissuade a young person from feeling like they have the confidence to do something, and that they could be one less barrier. I think when your parents or your family motivate you and they reaffirm that what you're doing is a great thing, that that catapults you. And when they're also doing it with you, that can move a mountain, because a lot of our students struggle reading. They don't like reading, but it's also because a lot of families aren't reading. A lot of people aren't reading to their kids, and the like what I hear, right, and what research has shown, and all these things, like they want the teachers to be the only lever that moves the child academically, but it really is like just sitting down at home for 10-15 minutes and reading with them, so that they know it's important. It's a bonding experience. It's something that becomes a memory for them. They play a huge role, and it also is a way for us to say that the school is just one piece of a larger puzzle. Like, kids should be able to trust adults and other people in their community, whether it's in school or not. And we should breed that culture, right? We should be creating a culture where young people are validated and seen, and not in like a giving advice way, but in an affirming way of like, oh, mijo, mija, like, what you're doing is good. Here's my 2 cents if you want it, if you want it. And then how can I help you continue on your path,
So before we close out, was there anything else you would like to add in regards to youth leadership, civic engagement, community engagement?
I don't think I have anything to add. I would just like reiterate that it's okay to start small and snowball into something bigger. And it's okay to take breaks in between that journey. But I think the most important part is just to be engaged in some way with the conversation, because whether we are directly, at meetings and speaking to people with the authority to make certain decisions or not, it still all affects us, or affects a person that we care about. So I would encourage people not to shy away from getting involved, even though, some of the things are really hard to digest. Because there's a lot of us that are trying to figure things out, and we need more hands. It can't be just the same people doing it all. I think there's a lot of competency in our community that we're just not tapping into because they're scared to enter the room.
Yeah. I agree. I think we can all find some way to get involved, and I think that we all have a small role that we can play, and that's going to look different for everybody. In the way that, like, the way that you show up isn't the way that I show up, and vice versa, and we all will show up in our own way that feels right for us. But we have that ability and to tap into that. Okay, so thank you, Adriana, for chatting with me and sharing your insights and sharing your story, your journey in being a board member, and what you've learned from it. So I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you to our listeners, or if you're watching this on YouTube, make sure you follow CIP on all our social medias to be updated on any events and any other podcasts that we have in the future. We hope that you will join us for the next one. Thanks.